Let's talk about superhero movies. All Marvel and DC superhero movies are adaptations of some kind. Some are fairly direct adaptations, like how the film Logan took from the comic book Old Man Logan. Some films are mismatches of several different comic book sources, with new material mixed in. For instance, Spider-Man 2 took from Amazing Spider-Man issue 3 with the origin of Dr. Octopus, issue 50 with the Spider-Man No More story arc, and much of the aesthetic of issue 33 for its climax. Then there are also the superhero movies that take little more than the vague mythos of the characters and build their own stories around that, The Dark Knight Rises being an excellent example. My point being, the way in which superhero movies engage with their source material is interesting and worthy of further study. Today I'm going to be talking about 2018's Into the Spider-Verse, which is a particularly interesting case in superhero adaptation due to the sheer number of sources it pulls from. Seriously, I had to buy a corkboard just to map them all out. Into the Spider-Verse was so good. The visuals were revolutionary, the voice acting ranged from good to great, and there's a great balance between humour, drama, and action. What's of particular interest to me, however, is how the movie came about. While adaptations are usually as simple as A to B, or in some cases A to B to C, this one certainly is not. In fact, if you zoom out, Into the Spider-Verse becomes a complicated web of citations. So, let's take a look at that. The first and most obvious source for the film is the 2014 Amazing Spider-Man story arc, simply titled Spider-Verse, by Dan Slott, Oliver Copiel, and Giuseppe Camuncoli. Spider-Verse was a comic book event, which took place mainly in the Amazing Spider-Man line of comics, with spin-off issues taking place in other ongoings, Spider-Woman and Spider-Man 2099. As well as a few miniseries created specifically for this story arc. Now, Spider-Verse is obviously the namesake for Into the Spider-Verse, but only the broad strokes of the plot are adapted into the film. The comic revolves around a superpowered family who hunts spider totems, that is, various spider-powered people across the multiverse. This is a mystical side to Spider-Man, introduced by writer J. Michael Straczynski. Anyway, the superior Spider-Man, who is of course Otto Octavius in Peter Parker's body, trying to turn over a new leaf as a hero, is the first to discover this, after he tries to return from the future to his own timeline. He traverses through dimensions to track down different Spider-People in order to fight off the family of hunters, eventually pulling in the modern-day Peter Parker, who has since reclaimed his body from Doc Ock. I love comics so much. Among the Spider-People pulled in by the superior Spider-Man are Miles Morales, Spider-Gwen, or Spider-Woman as she's known in-universe, Spider-Man Noir, and SPDR, all of whom are main characters in the film, and we'll get to them all individually a bit later. A huge difference between the comic and the film is that Spider-Verse is occasionally super grim. Like, look at this. It would have been pretty difficult to tell a story about an interdimensional family killing superheroes so they could feast on them and still keep the film PG. The biggest difference in my mind between the comic and the film, however, is the years of continuity that's built into the comic. To have a good understanding of the superior Spider-Man, you'd want to read Amazing Spider-Man issues 698 through 700, at the very least, just to understand his origin. And then probably the first 19 issues of the Superior Spider-Man series, just to see his character evolution to that point. In fact, when the Superior Spider-Man is first introduced in the main Spider-Verse story, the editor's note directs you to issue 19 of his series to understand why he's there. Now, films don't typically have this kind of continuity built around them, which could be a blessing or a curse depending on how you look at it. For instance, you have to introduce a character much more thoroughly than they do in the comics, because you can't just tell them to go watch another film. Into the Spider-Verse handled these introductions rather brilliantly, giving each Spider-Person their own sort of origin comic, which cut to a brief, often quite funny, action-packed info dump. Each of these is a direct filmic adaptation of a comic book work, within the larger frame of the Spider-Verse adaptation. Hell, the covers of these comics are nods towards this, crediting our universe's creators as the writers and artists behind those comics. So, the origin comic in the film of Peter Parker, the Spider-Man, can be read as an adaptation of Amazing Spider-Man 15 by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, which is where Spider-Man's origin was first told and the character was invented. However, it also contains clear nods to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. First, they show Spider-Man stopping a runaway train, like in Spider-Man 2. Next, they show the iconic kiss with Mary Jane from the first film, only to be revealed that she is the one who's hanging upside down, while Peter is standing on the ground. Finally, they refer to the controversial moment in Spider-Man 3 when a Venom-possessed Peter goes dancing down the street. Peter Parker in Into the Spider-Verse even acknowledges how lame this moment was.
We don't really talk about this.
This is a work of pastiche. It's poking lighthearted fun at a couple of events in the Spider-Man trilogy. But what it does here is effectively inform the viewer that the Spider-Man they're witnessing is much the same as the Tobey Maguire one, with a few differences. By twisting these illusions slightly, by inverting Mary Jane and placing the dancing Peter in the Spidey costume instead of in a suit, it shows that this is not a direct continuation or adaptation of the Raimi trilogy. This Spider-Man is a Peter Parker at the height of being Spider-Man. But he's not the only Peter Parker in this movie.
My name is Peter B. Parker.
Peter B. Parker is as close to an original creation as this movie has. His origin story shows him as similar to the Peter Parker before him, but one who spent 12 more years as Spider-Man. Like the other Peter Parker, Peter B. Parker references the Raimi trilogy, also having the inverted kiss with MJ signaling the same thing. However, those 12 extra years have been rough on him. This is a Peter who's lost Aunt May, all of his money, broken his back, gotten divorced from MJ, and is now living alone in a one-room apartment. This is a Spider-Man who cries in the shower, for God's sake. It's genuinely tragic. So, Peter B. Parker can also be read as an adaptation of the Sam Raimi trilogy, but one extrapolated to the worst possible run of being Spider-Man. Nevertheless, when he comes to Miles' universe, he has to be the best Spider-Man he can. Miles Morales is the star of this movie. The main crux of the story is him taking on the mantle of Spider-Man after the death of his universe's near-perfect Spider-Man. This part of the story is a fairly direct adaptation of Ultimate Fallout number 4 and Ultimate Comics Ultimate Spider-Man 1-5. Both terribly titled, but very good comics that showed Miles' origins. Much of these origins are folded into the Spider-Verse's storyline. For instance, in the comics, Miles was bitten by a genetically modified spider, which was accidentally stolen by his Uncle Aaron. Miles then gets superpowers, witnesses the death of Peter Parker, and attends his funeral, there deciding to take on the responsibility of being Spider-Man. And that's where the stories begin to diverge, as Peter B. Parker comes into the picture. But I enjoyed how Spider-Verse took from specific sequences from Brian Bendis' and Sarah Pichelli's story, and adapted them for film. For instance, in the comic, Miles asks Gwen Stacy why Peter chose to be Spider-Man, and she tells him directly. Instead, in the film, Miles watches Mary Jane speak from the crowd and gets inspired through her words to everyone. One of the coolest things that the film changed about Miles was turning him into an artist, and specifically a graffiti artist. In the comics, his suit is just given to him by Nick Fury. But in the film, he instead gets a very cool moment where he spray paints an old Spider-Man costume black and puts his red spider in the middle, as he claims the mantle of Spider-Man and literally makes it his own. Miles meeting another universe's Peter Parker is something that took place in the comics, actually before Spider-Verse, in 2014's Spider-Men, again by Brian Bendis and Sarah Pichelli. In some ways, this is an even more direct forebearer to the film than Spider-Verse was. It's a story of the main universe's Peter getting sucked into Miles' universe due to an accident. Miles and Peter work together to defeat the villain, before Peter can finally go home. The biggest difference, of course, being in the film, it's not just Miles and Peter. So the idea of Spider-Gwen came about during the planning for the various Spider-Verse comics. It was simple. One of the various spider people would be from a universe where instead of Peter Parker being bitten by a radioactive spider, his childhood crush Gwen Stacy would instead. The character was introduced in a special spin-off issue of the main Spider-Verse series called Edge of Spider-Verse number 2 by Jason Latour and Robbie Rodriguez. It's a fun alternate universe take on some familiar Spider-Man tropes, which was elevated by the brilliant artwork of Robbie Rodriguez. The look of Gwen and her universe transferred beautifully to Into the Spider-Verse. Of particular interest to me is what they chose not to adapt into the film. In the comics, Peter Parker is first shocked at seeing Gwen Stacy both alive and superpowered, since in his universe she was killed by the Green Goblin after he discovered Peter's secret identity. Peter then acts out in a protective manner over her, which she finds annoying and patronizing as a genuinely skilled, superpowered combatant. The arc is completed when Peter and Gwen have a heart-to-heart conversation about loss, and Peter relinquishes his fears by encouraging her to take the first swing at a bad guy. Into the Spider-Verse, however, does not have Peter B. Parker acknowledge the surprise of a living Gwen Stacy at all. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it continues the implication that Peter B. Parker is from some sort of Sam Raimi-esque universe. In the Raimi trilogy, Peter's first and only love interest is Mary Jane Watson. Gwen Stacy doesn't play a role there, so Peter has no reason to freak out at an alternate universe of her, considering she's someone he's never met. The other reason this change is so interesting to me is that it allows Gwen to be a character who isn't defined by her relationship with Peter Parker. Instead, she's just another superhero lost in an alternate dimension. It also frees up the main relationship of the film to be the possible one between Miles and Gwen, something adapted from 2017's Sitting in a Tree crossover between Spider-Gwen and Miles Morales' Spider-Man. Spider-Man Noir was first introduced in 2009, as part of Marvel's Noir line, along with 8 other series. The primary difference between the Spider-Man Noir of the comic and of the movie is that in the comics, he's played completely straight. He's a hard-boiled guy who says things like fella and dame unironically. In the film, they lean into the inherent ridiculousness of the character again and again. The first thing you notice is that he's in black and white, and despite being in a full-colour world, he stays in black and white. He was portrayed in this film by Nicolas Cage, who reportedly asked the directors if they wanted him to go full Cage on it, which they did. The result is a really funny, very silly, what-if type story about a Spider-Man PI who loves to punch Nazis. Like Spider-Gwen, SPDR is a character who was created specifically for the Spider-Verse crossover. Writer Gerard Way, yes, that Gerard Way, crafts a clear homage to anime, specifically giant robot ones. He even puts Penny Parker in amongst the kids from the Neon Genesis Evangelion show, a show I definitely understood, in an homage to the series. The adaptation ran this idea, and again punched up the comedy. On the one hand, it took the darker elements out. The Edge of Spider-Verse issue is fairly maudlin, and it's all about trying to take up a family mantle as the pilot of SPDR. In the film, Penny Parker is a brightly coloured anime-inspired figure who clashes against the normal art of the rest of the world. Her anime-ness and her high energy allow her to act as a comic relief figure like Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Ham. Peter Porker, the spectacular Spider-Ham, was introduced in the 80s during the height of the funny animal comic popularity. Spider-Ham proved so popular that he was then given his own series, which lasted for 17 issues. He's since popped up in different works over the decades. Like the other weird spiders, Spider-Ham is given his own distinct style, appearing like a Warner Brothers-esque cartoon, right down to dropping hammers and anvils on people. This is the kind of thing that a movie can do much easier than comics. Now, a comic typically has no more than 1 or 2 illustrators working on it, and strives for a homogeneous look. An animated film typically has a small army of animators working on it. And Into the Spider-Verse proves you can task different animators with creating different styles and still have a coherent work. While the main Spider-Verse comic wasn't able to do this, one of the spin-offs was able to achieve something similar. In Spider-Verse Team Up 2, Miles Morales is selected to track down more Spider-Men to help their cause. Along with him for the ride is the Ultimate Spider-Man from the TV show Ultimate Spider-Man, who is presented in the same animation style as when he's on TV. The duo then travels to another universe to get the help of their Peter Parker, who ends up being the Peter Parker from the 1967 Spider-Man TV show. What results is a comic with 3 distinct styles: Miles' photorealism, Peter's modern cartoon aesthetic, complete with Family Guy-style cutaway gags, and the 1967 Peter's universe. It's great. The main core of the Spider-Verse comic was told in the Amazing Spider-Man series, but This list shows the other story events that took place in the Spider-Woman comic, the Spider-Man 2099 comic, as well as many specially made comics for this event. Tie-in comics like these are particularly interesting to me. Typically the meat of the story is told in the main comic, and how much tie-ins matter varies from series to series. There have been famous cases like the X-Men series, Prelude to Schism, that had nothing to do with the series at all. Then there have been opposite cases, like how Journey into Mystery literally explained why Thor was able to finish the fight in Fear itself. What I'm saying is, tie-in comics fundamentally change the reading experience from person to person. Many readers will only ever buy the main series, while some completionists will buy the entire set, with all sorts of combinations in between. So, do they get more or less story than other readers? In the case of Spider-Verse, yes and no. Some tie-ins are just to help prepare the story a little. For instance, the Edge of Spider-Verse series is by no means a must-read, but it gives more context to these extra Spider characters. However, Spider-Man Team Up number 3 has a very important recruit who helps to swing the final fight. Without reading that comic, a super powerful ally comes to join the fray in the finale for apparently no reason. The funny thing is, the first 2 issues of Spider-Man Team Up don't have that large of a bearing on the main story at all, which just goes to prove that this sort of thing can be a crapshoot sometimes. Thanks to years of comic book history, comic books can just add a note when this happens. See issue X to understand why this happened. Editor. This is something that a movie just can't do. When you go to watch a film, you're entitled to expect a single piece of work. Even if it's part of a larger series or universe, you expect to be able to watch it without being blindsided by a random entrance in the third act with a note to go watch another film to understand why. This is part of the special temporal status of comics. As the reader, you control the pace in which the story is told. If you come to a point which doesn't make sense and are referred to a different issue by an editor, you can, in theory, put the comic down, walk to your nearest physical or online comic book store, and purchase that issue. You can read it, digest it, then return to the original comic. Such a thing in a theatrically released movie would be absurd and widely panned. Many comic book adaptations have attempted to mirror comic book aesthetics with differing results. For instance, Ang Lee's Hulk used split-screen insets to mimic a comic book page, with the exception that they were moving. Zack Snyder stuck famously close to the images of Watchmen and 300, a movie I will cover one day, to the point where some people found it distracting from the film. Into the Spider-Verse pays homage to the comic book form in a really staggering number of ways. One of the first things I noticed was the split screen that takes place when Miles is bitten by the radioactive spider. I found this interesting because it doesn't really mimic the panel 1 to panel 2 to panel 3 of a normal comic. Instead, it just shows the same thing happening from a slightly different angle each time. Pretty quickly, it moves to a shot of Miles' bloodstream, and again 3 panels appear. The first panel shows a vein with a small cluster of cells. Panel 2 is a closer shot of the same thing, showing some of the irradiated cells mingling with his red blood cells. Panel 3 is then a tight close-up of the same thing. Now, this is how a comic book can simulate a camera zooming in and out. For instance, the first page of Watchmen famously does this. What's cool about this shot in the movie is that the camera then zooms into the third panel, as we see the irradiated cells start to multiply and spread. First we're given the setup to show how a zoom would work in a comic, then the film actually zooms in, as only a film can do. It's a really cool use of technique. Later on, in the scene where Miles begins to discover his powers, narration boxes begin to appear around him, recording his thoughts as he narrates them out loud in the film.
That's weird. My pants shrank.
It's interesting since he both thinks it out loud as the narration box appears over him.
I think I hit puberty.
After he makes an embarrassing comment to his roommate, the box then appears without sound, first saying, "I should have kept," then, "that to myself." Again, this is the movie first showing a comic book technique and how it corresponds to filmmaking. In this case, it's narration and narration boxes, but then using that same method to do something that only a film can. In this case, the narration box being animated within itself, filling in as the thoughts occur to Miles. The film even takes the comic aesthetic as far as a word balloon popping up and even slightly rotating as Miles moves through in a panic, then following him sideways as he walks on the side of the wall. It's unbelievably cool. The film also has a lot of other nice touches, like the blams of comic book lettering popping up during different fights. All in all, the movie goes out of its way to mirror a comic book aesthetic, while still embracing the things that make film, and in particular animated films, such a different medium. Hell, when Miles is taking Peter B. Parker through the city, the screen again splits into 3 panels, except this time they animate in the order of Panel 1, Panel 3, and then Panel 2. This eschews the normal left to right order in which you would read a Western comic, because this isn't a comic, it's a movie. So, the first thing I noticed during Miles' opening scene is how well the scene uses music. It's an original song created for this movie by 2 currently massive pop musicians, Sway Lee and Post Malone. Watching Miles chill out and create his art to this piece gives a great sense of his age and the time and place of this movie. Contrast this with 2012's Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield, where the big musical number was a Coldplay song set to Peter riding his skateboard around an abandoned warehouse. This scene always stood out to me as a 40-something-year-old movie exec's idea of what it means to be young. Skateboarding and Coldplay. So, compared to this, watching a young kid listen to 2 immensely popular musicians while taking place in a fairly timeless activity is a much better use of music. But there's one other thing that stuck out even more than the music, and that's how Miles was listening to it. If you keep up at all with the behind-the-scenes creation of superhero movies, then you know exactly who owns the media rights to Spider-Man: Sony Pictures. This is important because the Avengers movies are made by Marvel Studios, and they didn't have the rights to use Spider-Man until they came to an agreement with Sony to share the character from Captain America 3 onwards. Before this, both the Raimi trilogy and Mark Webb's 2 features were the sole creation and property of Sony Pictures. And unless you've been living under a rock, you know that Sony Pictures is owned by a much, much larger corporation. That is, Sony itself. Now, Sony is the 97th largest company on the planet, and they made $77 billion in 2018. So, when Miles Morales' very first scene focuses on and lingers on a very specific Sony pair of headphones, it's obvious to say we're looking at a form of product placement. What's funny is that compared to other Sony films, this isn't even that blatant. 2012's Amazing Spider-Man was laughably full of Sony product placement. In the very next scene, Miles has to rush to get his laptop into his school bag before he can leave. While the headphones are given a prominent place in the scene, the laptop is quickly stuffed into his bag. At first I wondered why they didn't take this chance to stuff a Sony logo on the laptop as well, then I found out that Sony closed its laptop division in 2014, so there was no chance for that sort of product placement. Now, product placement is used in film for one main reason: money. And films take a lot of money to make. The budget for this movie was at least $90 million US. So, advertising Sony's products within this film, a Sony product, can help write off some of this cost. Getting those headphones in such a position of prominence in front of so many eyeballs is worth a lot of money. While movies are huge business, comics are not so much. The audience simply isn't as big. As such, the level of product placement is nowhere near as high. In fact, most comics go out of their way to not even inadvertently advertise a product, instead choosing to use in-universe examples, such as Starkle instead of Google, or products with a Pear logo instead of Apple. Your mileage will vary on how much product placement in film bothers you. Some people argue that the use of real-life products helps to create a sense of realism. Personally, I find it uncomfortable that Miles is essentially branded, in both senses of the word, from the very first minute we see him in this film. It's hard to believe that the web of citations could get any wider, but it is. As outlined in this Variety article, an earlier story of Spider-Man across different realities gathering together was 2010's Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. This game used Spider-Man, the then Ultimate Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2099, and Spider-Man Noir. In the article, Slott says that while he loved the idea, it bugged him that the Spider-Men never interact with each other in the game. Slott is then quoted as saying, "I said we should have them all interacting in a comic book and use every Spider-Man ever. Let's use every part of the Buffalo and throw every Spider-Man into some big adventure." The following year, the Spider-Man editorial office was pressing for Brian Bendis and Dan Slott to have a Miles and Peter Parker crossover between their two comics. But Slott knew it was a personal story for Bendis and wanted him to write that book solo, pitching that he would then use Miles in his Spider-Verse event later. So, Spider-Men came out in 2012, before Spider-Verse came out in 2014. Slott describes the process behind the comic book adaptation in this article fairly wonderfully. Marvel movies are based on comic runs. The movies touch on things the comics do, but they make them their own. The comics are an inspiration, a jazz riff. I think this is essentially true for most superhero adaptations. But where Into the Spider-Verse separates itself is on the sheer number of sources it takes from. To me, it's less of a jazz riff and more of a hip-hop producer or DJ taking samples from decades of continuity and melding them together to create something new. It's less Miles Davis than it is DJ Shadow or Madlib. At the end of the day, almost every single pin on this board can be traced back to the original creation of Spider-Man in 1962's Amazing Fantasy No. 15 by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. They're all different variations on the same riff, right up to the creation of Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen. Both Lee and Ditko passed away last year, at the ages of 95 and 90 respectively. But together they created an archetypal character who has been adapted, referenced, and recreated time after time in the past 50 years, with no signs of slowing down. It's a testament to the power of telling stories, but more specifically, the power of retelling stories. There's not necessarily that much new in Into the Spider-Verse, but the way it's brought together and constructed creates an entirely new work of art. It suggests that there's still a lot of miles to go in Lee and Ditko's creation, probably even enough for another 50 years. Thanks for watching. Wait, don't go yet! Consider subscribing to my channel? Every time someone clicks that button, I get a notification and then a brief rush of dopamine. So if you want to help me out there, please do. If you want to consider donating a little money to help me make these video essays, that would be a huge help. I've just launched a Patreon with monthly rewards and that sort of thing, which I've linked down below. If you click now, you might have the distinction of becoming my first patron. That's something. That's not nothing. Anyway, till next time.